My husband embarrassed me everywhere with his quirky behavior. Now, his family and coworkers avoid him after I gave him a taste of his own medicine. My husband Neil thought being quirky was a personality trait that made him interesting when really he was just an attention-seeking man-child who couldn't read a room. We'd been married for 3 years, and the first year was fine because we mostly stayed home during lockdowns. But once we started going out again, Neil's behavior became unbearable. He'd do weird voices at restaurants when ordering, like talking in a British accent to the confused waiter at Olive Garden. He'd make explosion sounds with his mouth when using the microwave at Target. He'd skip instead of walk through parking lots while I walked behind him mortified. He'd meow at cats in pet stores loud enough for everyone to hear. He'd narrate his grocery shopping like he was a sports commentator. When I asked him to stop, he'd say I was trying to dim his shine and suppress his authentic self. The first major incident was at my company dinner. My boss invited spouses to a nice steakhouse, and Neil showed up wearing a bow tie with LED lights that blinked. He brought a rubber chicken in his jacket and pulled it out during the appetizers, squeezing it to make noise. He told my boss's wife that he collected belly button lint and had jars organized by year. He ate his steak by cutting it into tiny pieces and arranging them into a smiley face. He asked the waiter if the cow had a name. My coworkers stared while Neil laughed at his own jokes. My boss asked if Neil was feeling all right. Neil said he was just being himself, and wasn't everyone else boring for wearing normal clothes and eating normally. I wanted to crawl under the table and die. After that, Neil got worse because he thought he'd been hilarious. At my cousin's wedding, he did the worm during the father-daughter dance. At the bank, he spoke only in rhymes to the teller trying to deposit our tax refund. At my doctor's appointment, he sat in the waiting room making paper airplanes and throwing them at other patients while making whoosh sounds. At the movies, he'd provide commentary about plot holes loud enough for 3 rows to hear. When people complained, he'd say they had no sense of humor. At my grandmother's funeral, he wore a Hawaiian shirt and told everyone death was just another adventure. My family was appalled, but Neil said he was celebrating life, not mourning death. He actually brought a kazoo and played it during the moment of silence. My aunt had to be physically restrained from attacking him. The grocery store became a nightmare. Neil would ride the cart like a scooter through aisles. He'd juggle apples and produce. He'd open boxes of cereal to smell them. He'd loudly announce prices like an auctioneer. He'd make race car noises pushing the cart. Other shoppers would move to different aisles to avoid us. Employees started recognizing us and looking tired when we walked in. Neil said grocery shopping was boring and he was making it fun. For who? I asked. For everyone, he said, even though everyone looked miserable. The breaking point was my high school reunion. I'd been looking forward to it for months and warned Neil to be normal for once. He promised to behave. He showed up wearing a cape he'd made from a shower curtain and introduced himself as Neil the Magnificent. He did magic tricks with the breadsticks. He challenged my former classmates to thumb wrestle. He started a conga line during the memorial for deceased classmates. He gave a toast even though nobody asked and told the story of our first date where I allegedly farted, which never happened. He made up a song about our school mascot and sang it badly. My old friends pitied me. That's when I decided to give Neil a taste of his own medicine. I started with his office. I showed up to his workplace with a boombox playing his favorite song and did an interpretive dance in the lobby. I wore a tutu and fairy wings and threw glitter everywhere. I told his receptionist I was his lunch delivery and needed to feed him personally. I baby talked to him in front of his colleagues and called him Snookums. I pinched his cheeks and said he was Mommy's special boy. Neil was mortified and dragged me outside asking what I was doing. I said I was just being quirky and authentic like he taught me. Next was his golf club. Neil took golf very seriously, and his club was full of lawyers and executives who valued professionalism. I showed up during his tournament wearing a dinosaur costume. I followed his group around making dinosaur noises and pretending to eat the golf balls. I did cartwheels on the green. I used their golf cart as a jungle gym. I told his golf buddies about Neil's hemorrhoids in graphic detail. I started a chant every time Neil tried to swing. The club manager asked us to leave, and Neil's buddies said he couldn't bring guests anymore. Neil begged me to stop, but I said he was trying to dim my shine. The masterpiece was his mother's birthday dinner. I'd been planning this night for weeks and ordered the chicken costume online from a place that made mascot outfits for sports teams. The restaurant was one of those places with white tablecloths and candles on every table where people went for anniversaries and proposals. I walked in through the front door at exactly 7:30, wearing bright yellow feathers from head to toe, with foam wings attached to my arms and an orange beak that stuck out 6 inches from my face. The hostess stared at me like I'd lost my mind, but I clucked loudly and flapped my wings asking for the Wallace party. She pointed toward the back corner where I could already see Neil sitting with his parents and sister at a round table near the window. I clucked my way through the dining room, weaving between tables while other customers turned to stare, and a few people pulled out their phones to record. Neil's face went white when he spotted me approaching, and his mother covered her mouth with both hands. His father looked confused. and his sister Valentina just froze with her water glass halfway to her lips. I flapped my wings one more time and settled into the empty chair next to Neil, making exaggerated chicken noises while arranging my tail feathers. Neil leaned over and whispered, asking what I was doing, but I just clucked at him and told him I was being authentic and quirky like he taught me. The waiter came over looking professional despite the giant chicken at his table and asked if I needed a menu. I told him in the highest baby voice I could manage that my special boy Neil needed his num-nums cut up really small because he was such a good boy. I reached over and pinched Neil's cheeks hard enough to leave red marks while he tried to pull away. His mother looked like she might pass out into her wine glass, and his father cleared his throat 3 times without saying anything. I pulled a plastic bib out of my costume and tied it around Neil's neck even though he kept trying to stop me. The waiter took our orders and I insisted on ordering for Neil, telling everyone that Mommy knows what her special boy likes best. Valentina excused herself to the bathroom and I could see her texting frantically as she walked away. When the appetizers arrived, I made airplane noises with each bite I fed to Neil, forcing the fork toward his mouth while he sat there mortified. I made him say thank you, Mama, after every single bite and wiped his mouth with napkin between each one. His father finally excused himself to the bathroom and didn't come back for almost 10 minutes. Other diners were definitely filming us now, and I could see flashes going off from multiple tables. Neil's face had turned completely red, and sweat was forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning. I reached into my costume and pulled out a scrapbook I'd been making for the past month with photos of every embarrassing thing Neil had done. I passed it to his mother first, explaining loudly that I wanted to share all of Neil's special moments with his family. The first page showed Neil doing the worm during the father-daughter dance at my cousin's wedding. The next page had pictures of him in the LED bow tie at my company dinner with the rubber chicken. I narrated each photo with enthusiasm, pointing out how creative and quirky Neil was being in every single one. His mother flipped through the pages, getting paler with each turn. Valentina came back from the bathroom and I handed her the scrapbook, watching her face change from confusion to complete horror as she saw her brother juggling apples at the grocery store and wearing a cape at my high school reunion. The main courses arrived, but nobody was eating anymore because I was still going through the scrapbook page by page. I showed them Neil playing the kazoo at my grandmother's funeral and doing magic tricks with breadsticks at my reunion. I explained how Neil always said he was just being himself and making things more fun for everyone. His mother set down her wine glass and said she had a headache. His father came back from the bathroom and looked at the scrapbook over his wife's shoulder before sitting down heavily in his chair. Neil finally grabbed my wing and dragged me up from the table, pulling me toward the exit. I clucked and flapped the whole way through the restaurant while everyone watched. He pushed through the front door and didn't stop until we were in the parking lot next to his car. He demanded to know what I was doing to his mother's special birthday dinner. I adjusted my beak and told him calmly that I was just being my authentic, quirky self, exactly like he'd taught me over the past 3 years. I asked why he was trying to dim my shine in front of his family when he always said being weird made life more interesting. He said this was completely different because it was his family and an important occasion. I pointed out that every single event I'd begged him to behave at was also important to me. My company dinner where my boss was there, my cousin's wedding that she'd planned for 2 years, my grandmother's funeral where my whole family was grieving, my high school reunion I'd looked forward to for months. He went quiet and I watched something change in his expression. We stood there in the parking lot for a minute while he processed what I'd said. He unlocked his car and we both got in, sitting in silence. 20 minutes passed with neither of us talking while Neil stared at the steering wheel. Finally, he admitted that experiencing his own behavior from the outside was awful. He said watching me embarrass him in front of his family made him feel sick and humiliated. He apologized for not listening when I told him how embarrassed I felt, saying he genuinely didn't understand until right now. I told him I needed to see real change, not just an apology in a parking lot, because I couldn't keep living like this. He nodded and said he knew. We agreed to skip the rest of the dinner and go home to have a real conversation about our marriage and what needed to happen next. He started the car and we drove home in silence while I sat there in my chicken costume watching the streetlights go by. The next morning, Neil's phone rang at 8, and I could hear his mother crying through the speaker from across the bedroom. She told him how humiliated she was at her birthday dinner and how all her friends saw the videos people posted online. Neil surprised me by defending me for the first time ever. He explained that he'd been doing the same things to me for years at events that were important to me. He told her about the company dinner and the funeral and the reunion. He said he finally understood why it was a problem and that he deserved what happened last night. His mother went quiet on the other end and then said she needed time to process everything. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a long text from Valentina. She wrote that she'd always thought her brother's behavior was obnoxious, but didn't realize how bad it had gotten or how much it was affecting me. She apologized for not saying something sooner and offered to help talk sense into him if I needed it. She said the scrapbook had been eye-opening and she couldn't believe he'd done all those things at important events. She ended the text by saying she was on my side and understood why I'd done what I did at the dinner. That same week, Neil brought up couples therapy while we were eating dinner at the kitchen table. He said we needed professional help to work on communication and boundaries. I almost dropped my fork because Neil had always said therapy was a waste of money for people who couldn't solve their own problems. I agreed right away and felt this huge wave of relief that he was taking our marriage seriously enough to get outside help. We found a therapist named Dr. Sutherland who had an opening the following week. The waiting room had beige walls and magazines about healthy living that nobody ever read. Neil kept tapping his foot against the chair leg until I put my hand on his knee to make him stop. Dr. Sutherland called us in, and we sat on a gray couch that made crunching sounds whenever we moved. She asked Neil to describe why we were there, and he said he liked being fun and spontaneous, but it was causing problems in our marriage. Dr. Sutherland wrote something in her notebook, and then asked Neil to describe my reactions to his behavior in detail. Neil started explaining how I'd asked him to stop at the company dinner and the wedding and the funeral. He described my face when he did the worm during the father-daughter dance. He talked about how I begged him not to embarrass me at my high school reunion. Hearing himself say it all out loud seemed to hit him differently than when I'd said the same things. His voice got quieter as he kept talking, and he looked down at his hands. Dr. Sutherland asked him what he noticed about the pattern in what he just described. Neil said every single time was an important event for me, and he'd made it about himself instead. Dr. Sutherland turned to Neil and asked why he needed so much attention from strangers. Neil sat there quiet for a minute and then admitted he'd always felt boring and unremarkable growing up. He said his older brother was the problem child who got all the attention, and Valentina was the achiever who made their parents proud. Neil was just the middle kid who got decent grades and played soccer okay, but never stood out. The quirky behavior started in college as a way to feel special and memorable. He said it felt good when people laughed or looked at him even if they were confused or annoyed. Over time, it became something he couldn't really control. He'd see an opportunity to do something weird, and the urge was too strong to resist. Dr. Sutherland nodded and made more notes. She asked me to share my experience, and I told her how isolated I'd become over the past 2 years. I stopped inviting Neil to events with my friends because I never knew what he'd do. I made excuses when coworkers were invited us to dinners. I dreaded going anywhere public with him. The grocery store made me anxious. Restaurants made me anxious. Even walking through a parking lot made me tense, waiting for him to start skipping or making noises. Dr. Sutherland said my feelings were completely valid, and that living with that level of uncertainty and embarrassment would make anyone anxious. She also said my revenge at his mother's birthday dinner, while understandable, wasn't healthy communication either. I'd responded to his behavior by doing the exact same thing back to him instead of setting clear boundaries. We both needed to work on expressing our needs in constructive ways. Dr. Sutherland asked if we were both willing to commit to better communication strategies. Neil said yes immediately, and promised to check with me before doing anything unusual in public. I said I'd work on being more direct about my boundaries instead of just suffering in silence and then exploding. Dr. Sutherland gave us homework assignments for the week. Neil had to practice asking me before doing anything that might be considered quirky or attention-seeking. I had to practice stating my needs clearly using specific language about what behaviors bothered me and why. She also gave us worksheets about respecting boundaries and expressing needs without blame. We scheduled another appointment for the following week. The drive home was quiet, but felt different from the tense silence after the birthday dinner. This felt more like we were both processing what we'd learned. Neil reached over and squeezed my hand at a red light. 2 weeks went by, and Neil seemed to be trying. He caught himself a few times about to do something weird and stopped. At the grocery store, he started to make race car noises with the cart, but then looked at me and just pushed it normally instead. I smiled at him, and he looked proud of himself. Things felt fragile but hopeful. Then a boss called Neil into his office at work on a Tuesday afternoon. Neil came home 3 hours early looking pale and shaky. He sat down on the couch and told me a boss had received complaints from multiple colleagues about his behavior. Samuel and some other coworkers reported feeling uncomfortable with Neil's constant disruptions during meetings and his attention-seeking behavior that made it hard to focus on work. A boss said the company valued professionalism and Neil's behavior wasn't meeting their standards. He put Neil on a performance improvement plan that required him to behave professionally at work for the next 90 days. If Neil couldn't meet the standards, he'd be let go. His actual job was at risk. Everything suddenly became very real in a way it hadn't been before. I felt this weird mix of vindication and concern sitting there watching Neil process what happened. Part of me thought he deserved consequences for years of not listening to me. But another part worried because my workplace stunt with the tutu and glitter probably contributed to his colleagues taking his behavior more seriously as a problem. Neil looked at me and said he never thought his behavior could have serious consequences like losing his job or damaging his career. He always thought it was harmless fun that people were too uptight to appreciate. Now he realized his coworkers had been uncomfortable for months or maybe years, and he'd been too focused on getting attention to notice or care. I told him this was his chance to show everyone, including himself, that he could change. He nodded but looked terrified. Over the next few days, Neil made genuine efforts to behave normally in public, even though I could see how hard it was for him. We went to the grocery store on Saturday, and I watched him grip the cart handle tight like he was physically restraining himself. He walked through the produce section without juggling anything. He went down the cereal aisle without opening boxes to smell them. He didn't announce prices or make sound effects. Other shoppers didn't stare at us or move to different aisles. The employees didn't look tired when we checked out. When we got to the car, Neil looked exhausted, like behaving normally had taken all his energy. I told him I was proud of him, and he said it felt weird but good. He said not embarrassing me felt better than getting attention from strangers. Jeremy from the golf club called Neil's cell phone that Sunday morning. I heard Neil answer, and then Jeremy's voice through the speaker saying the guys missed him and wanted to invite him back for a casual round. Jeremy said they understood the dinosaur costume incident was unusual, and they were willing to move past it. Neil looked at me and then told Jeremy he appreciated the invitation, but needed to decline. He explained he was taking a break from golf to focus on personal growth and his marriage. He said he needed to work on himself before he could be around people socially. Jeremy sounded surprised but said he understood and to call when Neil was ready. After Neil hung up, I asked why he turned down the invitation. He said he didn't trust himself yet not to do something inappropriate even if he didn't mean to. He wanted to be sure he could control his impulses before putting himself in social situations where he might embarrass me or himself again. I watched Neil make progress in therapy, but still worried about how he'd handle being around my coworkers again. My boss, Alma, was retiring after 25 years at the company and invited everyone to a party at this nice Italian restaurant downtown. Neil asked if I wanted him to stay home, and I almost said yes, but then realized that would just be avoiding the problem forever. We needed to test if the changes were real. The night of the party, Neil came downstairs wearing a normal button-down shirt and khakis. No LED bow tie. No rubber chicken bulging from his jacket pocket. No cape or costume pieces. Just regular clothes like a regular person going to a regular work event. We drove to the restaurant and I kept waiting for him to do something weird, but he just sat there listening to the radio. Inside, the private room was already full of my coworkers and their spouses. Several people looked up when we walked in, and I saw recognition flash across their faces. They remembered Neil from the company dinner disaster months ago. Neil squeezed my hand and walked over to the gift table to put down our card for Alma. He made small talk with the people standing nearby about the weather and traffic. Normal, boring conversation that didn't involve belly button lint or asking if cows had names. We found seats at a table with some of my work friends and their husbands. Neil introduced himself politely and asked them questions about their jobs and families. He laughed at their jokes without trying to one-up them with louder, weirder stories. When the waiter came around, Neil ordered like a normal human being using his actual voice. No British accent, no sound effects. He didn't cut his food into shapes or juggle the breadsticks. He just ate dinner and participated in conversation like everyone else at the table. Alma gave a speech thanking everyone for the years of friendship and support. Neil clapped at appropriate times and didn't interrupt or try to give his own toast. After dinner, people mingled and I watched Neil navigate the room. He complimented someone's tie. He asked genuine questions about vacation plans. He congratulated Alma on her retirement without making it about himself. When Alma walked past our table, Neil stood up and approached her. I held my breath waiting for something embarrassing, but he just smiled and told her the venue was really nice. Then he apologized for his behavior at the company dinner months ago. He said he'd been going through some personal issues and working on himself, and he was sorry for making her uncomfortable and embarrassing me in front of my colleagues. Alma looked surprised but touched. She thanked him for the apology and said she appreciated his honesty. They talked for a few more minutes about her retirement plans, and then she moved on to greet other guests. Neil came back to the table and I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. He'd actually done it. He'd behaved completely normally at a work event without me having to beg or threaten or embarrass him into it. Near the end of the party, Alma pulled me aside into the hallway outside the restrooms. She said she wanted to tell me how impressed she was by the change in Neil. She asked what happened and how we'd gotten from the LED bow tie disaster to tonight. I explained briefly about the therapy and how Neil had finally understood how his behavior affected me and everyone around him. I told her about the performance improvement plan at his work and how that had been a wake-up call about real consequences. Alma nodded and said she was genuinely happy for us. She mentioned that she'd worried about me after that first dinner, seeing how uncomfortable and embarrassed I'd been. She was glad Neil was working on himself and that we were working on our marriage together. We hugged and went back to the party. On the drive home, Neil asked how he did. I told him he was perfect and I was proud of him. He said it felt weird to just be normal at a party, but also kind of good. He didn't feel exhausted from trying to get everyone's attention. He could just relax and enjoy conversations without performing. A month into therapy, Neil had a major breakthrough during one of our sessions. The therapist had been asking him questions about his childhood and family relationships. Neil talked about being the middle child between his older brother who'd struggled with addiction and his sister Valentina, who was always achieving things and making their parents proud. He said he'd felt invisible growing up. His parents spent so much time dealing with his brother's problems and celebrating Valentina's accomplishments that Neil felt like he faded into the background. The therapist asked how that made him feel, and Neil got quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd felt like he didn't matter, like he was boring and forgettable compared to his siblings who demanded attention for different reasons. So he'd started acting out in quirky ways to get noticed. At first it was small things like making jokes or doing impressions, but over time it escalated into more extreme behavior because the small stuff stopped getting reactions. The therapist helped Neil see that his need for constant attention stemmed from those childhood feelings of being overlooked. He'd been trying to feel special and memorable and important by forcing people to notice him, even if they noticed him for the wrong reasons. Understanding the root cause seemed to help Neil think differently about his behavior. He started seeing it as a coping mechanism that had gotten out of control, rather than just his authentic personality. The therapist suggested Neil needed healthier ways to feel special and noticed. She recommended hobbies where his creativity and humor could shine in appropriate contexts. She mentioned things like improv classes or community theater, where being weird and spontaneous was actually valued and encouraged. Neil seemed interested in the idea of having an outlet for his energy that wasn't just disrupting normal social situations. The therapist gave him some information about local improv classes and comedy workshops. She said it might help him channel his personality into something productive instead of destructive. Neil looked at the papers on the drive home and seemed excited about the possibility. He said it would be nice to be weird somewhere people actually wanted to see it, instead of forcing it on people who just wanted to eat dinner or go to work. A week later, Neil signed up for a beginner improv comedy class that met Tuesday nights at a small theater downtown. He was nervous about the first session, but also more excited than I'd seen him in months. When he came home that night, he was practically bouncing with energy. He said it felt amazing to be in a room full of people who appreciated spontaneity and weirdness. The class did exercises where they had to think fast and be creative and say yes to whatever scene their partner started. Neil said he was good at it, and the instructor had complimented his energy. For the first time, his personality was an asset instead of a problem. Over the next few weeks, Neil came home from improv class energized and happy. He'd tell me about the games they played and the scenes they created. He was making friends with the other students who shared his sense of humor. Having a regular outlet seemed to calm down his need to perform everywhere else. He still had moments where I could see him wanting to do something weird in public, but he'd catch himself and save it for improv class instead. 2 months into the class, the students were doing a showcase performance for friends and family. Neil invited me to come watch. I sat in the small theater with about 50 other people and watched Neil perform with his classmates. They did short improvised scenes based on audience suggestions. Neil was genuinely funny. He got big laughs from the crowd through actual comedy instead of just being inappropriate or shocking. Watching him shine on stage in a context where his personality was appreciated made me feel hopeful about our future. This was what he needed all along. A place where being weird was the point, not a disruption. After the show, several of his classmates came up to me and said nice things about Neil. They said he was talented and brought great energy to the group. Neil glowed from the praise. On the drive home, he thanked me for supporting him through therapy and helping him find this outlet. He said he finally understood the difference between being authentically himself in appropriate contexts versus forcing his personality on people who didn't want it. At work, Neil's performance improved dramatically once he stopped disrupting meetings and making everything about getting attention. He focused on his actual job, and his colleagues started taking him seriously. A boss called him into his office one afternoon, and Neil came home with good news. The performance improvement plan was officially lifted. A boss had complimented Neil's recent professionalism and his contributions to their latest project. Neil's ideas were being heard now because he presented them professionally instead of undermining himself with inappropriate behavior. We decided to host a small dinner party at our house to celebrate how far we'd come. We invited Valentina and a few friends Neil had made through improv class. I was nervous about Neil hosting because I'd never seen him do it without crossing lines or making people uncomfortable. But Neil was a gracious host. He made people feel welcome. He told funny stories from improv class without being obnoxious. He asked guests about themselves instead of dominating every conversation. People genuinely had a good time. After everyone left, several friends texted to say what a nice evening it had been. 3 months into therapy, we got invited to another wedding. This was our first major test since everything changed. Weddings had been Neil's worst settings in the past. He'd done the worm during my cousin's father-daughter dance. He'd made a scene at every wedding we'd attended. I was terrified he'd backslide. We got dressed that morning and Neil wore a normal suit. No cape, no LED accessories, no props hidden in his pockets. At the ceremony, he sat quietly and watched without commentary. During the reception, he danced normally when the music started. The DJ tried to get him to do something wild on the dance floor, pointing at him and encouraging him to show off some moves. Neil just smiled and kept dancing regular. During the father-daughter dance, I squeezed Neil's hand. I was remembering how he'd done the worm during this exact moment at my cousin Kavia's wedding. How mortified I'd been watching him roll around on the floor while everyone stared. Neil squeezed back. He leaned over and whispered that he was sorry for ruining that memory for Kavya and for embarrassing me so badly that day. I watched the rest of the ceremony with my heart feeling lighter than it had in months. Neil kept his promise through the entire reception. He danced with me during the slow songs without making jokes or doing anything weird. He chatted with other guests about normal topics like their jobs and vacations. He congratulated the bride and groom without creating a scene or drawing attention to himself. On the drive home, I told him how proud I was of his behavior. He smiled and said it felt good to attend an event without ruining it for everyone. The next week, Neil called Kavya to apologize for wrecking her wedding. He explained that he'd been in therapy working on himself and finally understood how disrespectful his behavior had been during her special day. I sat nearby listening to his side of the conversation, nervous about how she'd react after everything he'd put her through. Neil's voice stayed calm and sincere as he took full responsibility without making excuses. When he hung up, he told me Kavya had accepted his apology. She said she appreciated him taking accountability instead of brushing it off like she'd expected. She even thanked him for calling because it showed real growth and maturity. Neil looked relieved and a little emotional after the call ended. Over the next few weeks, my family started warming up to Neil again after hearing about his therapy progress. My mom called to say she'd noticed a real change in his attitude and behavior. My dad texted Neil directly to say he was proud of him for doing the hard work to become better. Even my aunt, who'd almost attacked him at my grandmother's funeral, reached out. She invited us to Thanksgiving dinner at her house, though she made it clear the kazoo incident wasn't forgotten or forgiven yet. Neil thanked her for giving him another chance and promised to behave appropriately. Our 4th anniversary arrived in late October, and Neil made reservations at a nice restaurant downtown. I got dressed up in a new dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Neil wore a regular suit with no LED accessories or weird props hidden in his pockets. At dinner, he handed me a card before we ordered our food. Inside was a long handwritten note apologizing for the past year and thanking me for not giving up on him. He wrote that my dramatic revenge had been the wake-up call he needed, even though experiencing his own behavior from the outside had been painful and embarrassing. He said he was committed to being a better husband and partner moving forward. I teared up reading his words and squeezed his hand across the table. We had a wonderful dinner with normal conversation and no disruptions. Other diners didn't stare at us or move to different tables. The waiter didn't look confused or uncomfortable taking our order. It felt like how dating and marriage should feel instead of the constant anxiety I'd lived with for so long. During our next therapy session, we worked through my lingering resentment about all the events Neil had ruined. The therapist helped me process my anger about the company dinner that had damaged my professional reputation. We talked about the wedding where he'd done the worm during the father-daughter dance. We discussed the funeral where he'd played a kazoo during the moment of silence. The therapist asked if I was ready to forgive Neil and stop holding past incidents over his head. I admitted that I still brought up his worst moments during arguments, using them as weapons when I was angry. The therapist explained that real forgiveness meant letting go of those past hurts if we wanted to move forward together. It wouldn't be easy, but I needed to stop punishing Neil for things he was actively working to change. I looked at Neil sitting beside me and saw genuine remorse in his eyes. I told him I forgave him for embarrassing me and damaging relationships that mattered to me. He cried and hugged me tight, promising to keep working on himself every single day. Neil finished his improv class in early November and performed in their final showcase. The instructor pulled him aside afterward and invited him to join an ongoing comedy troupe that performed monthly at a local theater. Neil came home excited about the opportunity to continue doing improv with people who appreciated his energy and creativity. Having a regular outlet where his personality was valued instead of being a problem transformed his whole attitude. He stopped feeling the need to be quirky and weird in inappropriate settings because he had a place where that behavior belonged. He practiced his improv scenes at home and asked for my feedback on his characters and jokes. I loved seeing him channel his creativity into something productive and fun. Liana called in mid-November to invite us to a makeup birthday dinner. She wanted to celebrate properly after the disaster I'd caused at her original party. I felt nervous accepting the invitation because I'd been so awful at that restaurant. But Liana insisted she wanted us there and appreciated the work we'd both done to improve our marriage. Neil and I got dressed normally on the night of the dinner. No chicken costume for me, no cape or LED accessories for Neil. We arrived at the restaurant and found Liana, Dario, and Valentina already seated at a nice table. Everyone hugged us when we walked up. Liana looked genuinely happy to see us both. The dinner went perfectly. Neil was charming and appropriate the entire time. He asked his parents about their recent vacation and listened to their stories without interrupting or making jokes. He complimented the food without doing anything weird with it. He thanked his mother for inviting us and said he was sorry for his past behavior at family events. Liana teared up and told Neil she was proud of the effort he was putting into growing as a person. She said she could see real changes in how he carried himself and interacted with others. Dario agreed and said he was glad Neil had gotten the help he needed. Valentina smiled at both of us and said we seemed genuinely happy together for the first time in years. 6 months after starting therapy, our therapist said we'd made remarkable progress. We'd worked through major communication issues and established healthy boundaries in our relationship. Neil had learned to channel his energy appropriately, instead of seeking attention in disruptive ways. I'd learned to communicate my needs directly, instead of suffering in silence and building resentment. The therapist suggested we could move to monthly check-ins instead of weekly sessions. We both felt ready for that transition. Jeremy called Neil in early December to invite him back to the golf club officially. The membership committee had voted to lift the guest restrictions after hearing about Neil's therapy and changed behavior. Jeremy said the guys missed having Neil around and wanted to give him another chance. Neil accepted the invitation and played around with his old buddies the following weekend. He came home happy and relaxed, saying he'd managed to be fun and social without doing anything inappropriate or embarrassing. His golf buddies had welcomed him back without judgment and seemed glad to have him in the group again. At work, Neil's reputation improved dramatically after months of professional behavior. Samuel stopped by our house one evening and mentioned that Neil had become one of the more respected team members. People actually sought out his input during meetings because his creativity and humor came through in his work contributions rather than disruptive behavior. Samuel said Abbas had praised Neil's recent performance and mentioned him as a candidate for the next promotion cycle. Neil glowed from the compliment and thanked Samuel for believing in him through the rough period. That night, as we got ready for bed, Neil suggested we plan a vow renewal ceremony. He wanted to recommit to our marriage with a better understanding of respect, boundaries, and authentic communication. I loved the idea, and we started researching venues and planning details for a small ceremony with close family and friends. 3 weeks before the showcase, Neil started practicing his improv routines in our living room every night. He'd set up a makeshift stage area with our coffee table pushed against the wall and perform scenes based on random prompts I'd call out. I watched him transform everyday situations into comedy sketches, using the same wild energy he used to bring to grocery stores and restaurants, but now it actually made me laugh instead of cringe. His timing improved with each practice session, and he learned to read the room, adjusting his performance based on my reactions. I suggested he record himself to watch back later, and seeing himself perform helped him refine his material even more. The night before the showcase, Neil couldn't sleep and kept running through his routines in his head. I told him he'd be great, and reminded him this was exactly where his personality belonged, on a stage in front of people who came to be entertained. The showcase took place at a small theater downtown with about 200 seats. Local comedy producers sat in the front rows, scouting for talent to invite into their professional workshops. Neil performed a 10-minute set that brought down the house. He did characters and voices and physical comedy, all the things he used to do inappropriately, but now the audience roared with laughter instead of staring in uncomfortable silence. I sat in the back row with tears in my eyes, watching my husband finally shine in the right context. After the show, 3 different producers approached Neil with business cards and invitations to audition for their comedy programs. One woman told him he had natural stage presence and comic timing that couldn't be taught. Neil practically floated out of the theater, clutching the business cards like they were lottery tickets. 2 months later, my high school invited alumni back for a 5-year follow-up reunion event. I almost didn't want to go after the disaster last time, but Neil promised he'd be on his best behavior. We walked into the hotel ballroom together, and I braced myself for another nightmare. Instead, Neil charmed everyone he talked to. He asked thoughtful questions about their careers and families. He told funny stories from his improv classes without making anyone uncomfortable. He complimented the decorations and thanked the planning committee for organizing the event. My former classmates pulled me aside throughout the night to tell me what a great guy Neil was, and how lucky I was to be married to someone so funny and personable. 3 different people said they wished their spouses were as engaging as Neil. I kept waiting for him to do something embarrassing, but it never happened. He stayed appropriate and delightful the entire evening. On Monday morning, Alma called me into her office at work. She closed the door and asked me to sit down, which made my stomach drop. Instead of bad news, she offered me the senior analyst promotion I'd been passed over for after the original company dinner disaster. She said the leadership team had been impressed by my professionalism over the past year and the way I'd handled personal challenges while maintaining excellent work performance. The promotion came with a significant raise and my own office. I accepted immediately and thanked her for the opportunity. Alma smiled and said she was glad things had worked out for me and Neil, that sometimes people just need the right push to grow up. Planning our vow renewal ceremony took 3 months of careful preparation. We kept the guest list small, just close family and friends who'd stuck by us through everything. We chose a garden venue with white chairs and flower arrangements everywhere. I wore a simple cream dress and Neil wore a navy suit without any LED accessories or rubber chickens. The ceremony itself felt magical in ways our original wedding hadn't. Back then, we were young and naive, thinking marriage would be easy. Now we understood it required work and communication and mutual respect. Neil's vows made everyone cry and laugh at the same time. He promised to always check with me before doing anything unusual in public. He thanked me for not giving up on him when he was being an insufferable attention seeker. He said I'd made him a better person by refusing to enable his bad behavior any longer. My vows focused on learning to communicate my needs instead of suffering in silence. I promised to tell him directly when something bothered me instead of building resentment. I thanked him for doing the hard work in therapy and taking responsibility for his actions. When we kissed, everyone applauded, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. Valentina gave a toast that had the whole room in tears. She talked about growing up with Neil and watching him struggle to find his place in the family. She said she was proud of him for doing the difficult work to become a better husband and person. She thanked me for loving her brother enough to give him the wake-up call he desperately needed. Even Liana and Dario seemed moved by how much Neil had changed and grown. Liana hugged me after the ceremony and whispered that she was grateful I hadn't divorced her son. 3 weeks later, Jeremy called Neil about helping organize the golf club's annual charity tournament. The membership committee wanted to recognize Neil's creativity and energy as assets when properly directed. Neil threw himself into the planning with enthusiasm. He designed fun challenges for each hole, organized a silent auction, and recruited local businesses to sponsor prizes. The tournament raised more money than any previous year, and the club president publicly thanked Neil for his outstanding contribution. Neil beamed with pride, finally getting positive recognition for his creativity instead of complaints about his behavior. A year after I showed up in the chicken costume at his mother's birthday dinner, Neil and I celebrated our anniversary at the same restaurant. We laughed about how far we'd come since that mortifying night. Neil still had quirky moments, like making up silly songs while doing dishes or doing voices when we watched movies at home, but he'd learned when and where they were appropriate. He always checked with me first if he was unsure whether something would embarrass me. The Professional Comedy Workshop accepted Neil's application in September. He started performing at local clubs on weekends, doing 15-minute sets that got better each time. I attended every show and felt genuine pride watching him succeed at something he was passionate about. The audience loved him, and he finally got to be weird in a context where it was celebrated instead of tolerated. Other comedians told him he had real potential and should consider doing it full-time eventually. We started planning a real vacation together to celebrate how far we'd come. Neil suggested Hawaii, and I actually felt excited instead of dreading what he might do on the plane or at the resort. He'd found healthy outlets for his personality through improv and comedy. I'd learned to communicate better and set clear boundaries. We'd built a marriage based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than me just enduring his behavior while resentment festered. Our therapist said we'd done remarkable work and should be proud of ourselves. Sometimes I still couldn't believe we'd made it through that dark period without getting divorced. The chicken costume incident could have ended our marriage, but instead it became the turning point that saved us.